Today we're going to start with lesson 1.1, and 1.1 is all about straight time pay. So before we begin, I want you to think about why is it important for you to understand the information on your paychecks. Some of these reasons may be to make sure you're getting paid correctly. You work the hours, you want to make sure you get paid for it. You may also want to make sure that the correct taxes are going to be sent out or were taken out. So this will be something we talk about in later chapters. But for today, we're going to start with the basics. So our vocabulary. The first word we have is hourly rate. Your hourly rate is how much you make per hour, or a fixed amount of money you receive each hour you work. Okay? And we can calculate your straight time pay by multiplying the hourly rate times the number of hours that you worked. So think about that for a minute. If you work 5 hours and you make $10 per hour, 5 times 10, you would make $50. And that's your gross income. Your gross income can also be called your gross pay or your gross amount. This is just the total amount of money earned. Okay, the total amount of money earned. And this is before taxes are taken out. And once again, we'll be talking about that in a little bit. All right, so we're going to go straight into examples. We have Destiny is a mail clerk at an advertising firm. She earns $12 per hour. This week, she worked 39 and a half hours. What is her straight time pay for the week? Okay, so going back to our formula, we want to take her hourly rate and multiply by the number of hours she worked. Okay, so Destiny's hourly rate, she makes $12 per hour, and we're going to be multiplying that by the number of hours she worked. Okay, she worked 39 and a half hours. Because we're going to be doing calculations using a calculator, 39 and 1/2 is not so easy to put into a calculator. So 1/2 is the same thing as saying 0.5, or in our case, 39.5 hours. What is her straight time pay for the week? Do that calculation. So Dusty made a gross pay, or her straight time pay for the week, of $474. And please make sure you include the dollar sign. If you want to make it 0.00, that is fine as well. Because this was an even $474, you do not have to include the 0.00. All right, so example 2, we have Jimmy, and Jimmy works for a lawn service company. He earns $11 per hour. This week, he worked 26 3/4 hours. What is his straight time pay for the week? Okay, so starting with how much he earns per hour, we have 11 hours. And we're going to be multiplying that by the number of hours he worked. 26 3/4. So think about that. 3/4. If I have 3/4, that's how many cents? 26.75. Because 75 cents is 3/4. Okay, go ahead and calculate your 11 hours times your 26.75, your $11 per hour times your 26.75 hours. When we multiply the two, we get $294.25. Remember, you do need to include the cents when applicable. All right. Example 3. Jordan works for this local movie theater. He worked 22 hours this week after school. If he is paid $9.50 per hour, how much money did he make? Go ahead and complete this one on your own. When you multiply the 22 hours times your $9.50 per hour, you will find that Jordan made $209. And that was his gross pay, or his gross amount, or his gross income. Remember, those words are kind of interchangeable. All right, so example 4 gets a little bit different. We have Ralph is an accounting clerk. He earns $14.40 per hour. How many hours per week must he work if he wants to earn approximately $550 per week? Okay, so this one we're working backwards. We don't have the number of hours and how much he makes per hour. So we're going to set up an equation to solve this. Okay, so typically we're starting out with the number of hours he works. We don't know that. We only know how much he makes per hour. But we know in order to calculate that 550, we would have multiplied the 1440 times the number of hours he worked. Okay, so to set up an equation for this, 1440, that is the number or the amount per hour. And we want to multiply that times the number of hours he worked. This is our unknown or our variable. So we're going to use x. And we wanted him to make approximately $550. So then you got to think back to your algebra class. How would you solve this one-step equation? Currently, I have multiplication happening between 1440 and x. The inverse operation of multiplication is division. So I'm going to divide both sides by 1440. This isn't the easiest to do on the computer, but hopefully you get the gist. Okay, so divide both sides by 1440, and we're left with x equals 38.1944444. And that's why this question asks approximately how many hours he worked per week. So Ralph approximately worked 38 hours. Okay, so round to the nearest hour for our purposes on this. And number 5 is very similar. We have Bobby is an office manager at a weekly newspaper. He earns $22.50 per hour. How many hours per week does Bobby work if he earns $522 per week? So we're going to set it up very similarly to the last one. We know he makes how much per hour? We know he makes $22.50. Our unknown is the number of hours that he's working, or our unknown is x. And I know if I multiply those two, I will get $522. So same thing as before. I have a one-step equation. There's multiplication happening. The inverse operation of multiplication is division. So I know I need to divide by the coefficient, or divide by the number in front of x. So I'm going to be dividing both sides by 2250. So go ahead and do that on your own. 522 divided by 22.5 or 22.50. And you should get 23.2. Because this is a terminating decimal, let's just use it as written. So he worked 23.2. And include your units. 23.2 what? He worked 23.2 hours. Okay, and lastly, you have Lauren. Lauren earns $8.35 an hour as a lifeguard. How many hours per week must she work if she wants to earn approximately $190 per week? So remember, if we see the word approximately, there's going to be some rounding involved. This is another one where we need to write a one-step equation in order to solve it. We need to work backwards. We know she makes $8.35 an hour. And I'm going to need to multiply that by those numbers of hours she worked. Do we know how many hours she worked? No. So I'm going to use a variable. And you don't have to use X every time. You can use an H for hours if that's what you want. It's totally up to you. And we want approximately $190. Same thing as before. Go ahead and solve it. So you should be dividing both sides by 835 or 8.35. So once you do your division, how many hours did she work? Or approximately how many hours did she work? This is a non-terminating decimal. It is irrational. So we're going to round it, we'll say, to the nearest tenth this time. Okay, so if I want to round this to the nearest tenth, I'm going to look at the hundredth, or I'm going to look at the decimal 2 places after the decimal point. In this case, it's a 5. Okay, so I'm going to type this out so we can kind of see what's happening. Okay, I want to round to the nearest tenth, so I'm going to look at this one. I'm going to cut that 4 off. If I want to round this to the nearest tenth, I look at the one that follows it. It is a 5. So if this number that follows where you want to round is a 5 or above, that means you need to bump this guy or bump this tenth up 1. So if we round it to the nearest tenth, it becomes 22.8 hours. And once again, do not forget your units. So 22.8 hours, I'm going to bold that because that is the answer I would be looking for. Okay? So there's your straight time pay. That's all of 1.1. Today we're going to start section 1.2. 1.2 is all about overtime pay. And overtime pay is exactly what it sounds like. Pay that you make past the number of hours you typically work. Okay, so when you work more than your regular allotment of hours, which in most cases that's 40 hours per week, you'll start to earn overtime pay. The overtime rate, called time and a half, so this is the most common, is usually 1.5 times your hourly rate. Okay, so this could be calculated by taking your hourly rate and multiplying by 1.5 or 1.5. You can also receive more than that. And this happens a lot on holidays, on the weekends, depending on where you work. You could make double time. So double, meaning 2, you can make twice as much per hour than you typically make normally. So a little example, if I make $10 an hour and I have my 1.5 times my hourly rate for my time and a half, I could take my 10 and multiply by 1.5. Time and a half, 10, plus half of that, 5. 10 plus 5, $15 per hour. Or I could have just done 10 times 1.5 in my calculator if I had to. If I'm looking at double time, 10, double is 2, 10 times 2, 20. I'd be making $20 an hour. And sometimes you can get really lucky and make triple time. And these are usually on the holidays. Triple time, triple is 3, 10 times 3. If I'm working overtime, I could be making potentially $30 per hour. So overtime is a great way to make a lot of extra money if you have that offered. And one thing to keep in mind, this is typically not going to happen in jobs where you're salaried. This is places where you're paid per hour. Okay. So in order to do this, there's a few formulas that we're going to use. We're going to start with calculating the straight time pay, like we did in section 1.1. And just like we did there, our hourly rate times our regular hours. So you got to make sure you read the question thoroughly to see what those regular hours are. Like I said, typically it's 40 hours per week, but you got to read it because some jobs have different requirements. Okay, so we have Alan, and he's paid $8.20 an hour for a regular 40-hour week as a restaurant host. His overtime rate is 1.5 times his regular hourly rate. This week, he worked his regular 40 hours plus 10 hours of overtime. What is his total pay? All right, so we're going to start with that straight time pay, just like we did previously. His hourly rate, we know his hourly rate is $8.20. Then we're going to multiply that by the regular hours that he worked. It tells us his regular 40-hour week. So we're going to multiply that by 40. Go ahead and find his straight time pay, just like you did last lesson. So Alan's straight time pay should be $328. Okay, so that's just like what we already did. Here's the new part, finding the overtime pay. To find the overtime pay, we need to take the overtime rate and multiply by the overtime hours worked. Okay, the overtime rate. He makes 1.5 times his usual rate, or his hourly rate of $8.20. So we need to multiply $8.20 first times how he's being paid, 1.5 times, or 1.5, to find what his actual overtime rate is. So when I multiply these two, what will his overtime rate be? Alan's overtime rate will be $12.30 per hour. And I'm just going to label this so we have it. This is his overtime rate. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and calculate. In order to find the actual pay, or that additional chunk of money for working the overtime, you're going to take that overtime rate, or in our case, the $12.30, and you're going to multiply by the number of overtime hours worked. So we go back to that word problem. His regular work week is 40, but his hours of overtime, there's 10 of them. So we're not going to use this 40 again. Get rid of that guy. We're going to use the 10 hours of overtime. So we're going to multiply by 10 because that's how many extra hours he worked. So take that $12.30 and multiply by 10 and find how much the overtime pay is. So in overtime pay, Alan made $123. Okay, so his normal pay rate, or his straight time pay, $328. That's what he typically brings in every week. but then he worked extra, and he earned an extra $123. So think about what we need to do with those two numbers. 328 normally, I worked an extra 123 in order to find the total pay. So total pay is what you have, including your straight time and overtime pay. You're going to add those two. So $328 plus your $123 to find his total pay. And you will get that Alan made $451. So this is the final answer. So there are a few steps to it, but as you get them, or as you practice, you'll get them much quicker. All right. So moving on to more examples. Have Alex makes $9 an hour. He worked 40 regular hours and 6 hours at time and a half. So there's those overtime hours. Find the total pay Alex earned. So just like we did on the example before, we're going to start by finding the straight time pay. So Alex makes $9 an hour times the number of hours, or the number of regular hours. $9 times 40. 9 times 40. Go ahead and find Alex's straight time pay.
Logan Harvey, please report to the front office. Logan Harvey, to the front office, please.
Alex made $360 straight time pay. But then he worked overtime. Okay, so I'm going to label this with the straight time pay just so we keep it organized. All right, so the overtime pay. These are the hours past the original work week of 40 hours. The 6 hours at time and a half. So first we need to find the overtime rate. So in order to find the overtime rate, you're going to take the rate per hour, or the 9, and you're going to multiply that by how it's being calculated, or in this case, time and a half. Time and a half, that number you always want to remember, 1.5. So 9 times 1.5 is 13.5, or $13.50. This is how much Alex is making per hour of overtime hours. Okay, so this is her overtime rate. So we're going to use that overtime rate of $13. Let me move this over. Of $13.50. And we're going to multiply that by the number of overtime hours she worked, or he worked. So he worked 6 hours at that time and a half. So $13.50 times 6. Tell me what that's going to be. And you should have gotten $81. So that is the overtime pay. And we wanted to find the total pay. So the total pay, we're going to take the straight time pay and add the overtime pay to it. So $360 plus the $81 worth of overtime pay gives you a total pay of, correct, $441. Okay, so Alex made $441. Typically, he would make $360, but because he worked those extra 6 hours, it went all the way up to $441. Okay, so next we have Rose. Rose makes $11.50 an hour. In this week, she worked 36 regular hours, so her job's a little bit different. It's not that typical 40-hour week. Hers is a 36-hour week, and 7 hours at double time. So think about what number means double time. What would we be multiplying that rate by? And we want to find the total Rose earned. Okay, so starting with her straight time pay, we're going to take that $11.50 and multiply by the number of regular hours. In her case, it's 36 hours. Go ahead and find that straight time pay. And you should get $414. So that's what she usually brings home every week. But this week she has some overtime. Okay, so her overtime, first we got to find her overtime rate. So her typical rate, $11.50, times how she's being paid for that overtime. She's being paid at double time. And we already know double means 2. So we're going to take that rate of $11.50 and we're going to multiply by 2. And you should get a rate, an overtime rate of $23 per hour. That's her overtime rate. Now that we have that, we're going to take her $23 and multiply by only the numbers of overtime she worked. So the number of overtime she had, the number of hours, is 7. So 23 times 7, go ahead and tell me what her overtime pay is going to be. Correct. You should have gotten $161. And now to bring it all together, her total pay. Rose made $414 straight time pay. Her overtime pay is $161. Go ahead and calculate the total pay. So you would do this by adding the 2 together. And when you add the 2 together, you will get $575. Okay, so that's our lesson today. Overtime pay. You have a ton of opportunities and many jobs to work overtime. And you can see that with just a little bit of extra work, you could bring home a lot more money.